Hello viewers, and welcome to yet another Warhammer 40,000 Conquest video production. My name is Mitch, and I am the Hive Tyrant. In a previous video, I introduced and reviewed the first Warlord of the Warlord cycle of war packs, Ragnar Blackmane, along with his associated signature squad. But today, we're going to be taking a look at the rest of the non-signature cards for each of our 7 base factions that were included within the Howl of Blackmane war pack. Although by the time of my making this video, we've seen the release of the Warlord cycle in its entirety, and in fact, even the pre-release of the Great Devourer Deluxe expansion, today I'm only going to be assessing and discussing the card combinations and synergy available when this war pack was first released. Nevertheless, in later videos covering future expansions, I'll revisit these cards when new, powerful uses and combos become suddenly possible through the evolution and growth of our card pool. Although I'm sure to miss some uses for these cards over the course of this video, be sure to mention your personal favorites in the comments below. But, with that said, first off, we have a trio of new Astra Militants cards, beginning with the 3-cost Interrogator Acolyte. It has 1 command icon, a loyal icon, an attack value of 2, and 2 hit points. It has the Soldier and Inquisitor traits, as well as Interrupt. When this unit leaves play, draw 2 cards. So, it's certainly expensive relative to its stats, but this nevertheless does strike me as a bit of a value card. Under normal circumstances, you typically only pay 2 resources for a 1 icon, 2 attack, and 2 HP army unit. However, while this unit costs an additional resource beyond our established norm, when it leaves play, that extra invested resource is essentially transformed into your drawing 2 additional cards. And considering that most players tend to equate 1 card as being approximately equal to upwards of 2 resources apiece, despite that seemingly high initial investment, this card does seem like it can provide a surplus of value. And all the more when you consider that this unit's interrupt ability triggers upon its leaving play, it's easier to activate this ability than if it were to require the unit to be outright destroyed, and for that reason it combos exceptionally well with something akin to Captain Marcus or any other kind of card effect which requires you to sacrifice a unit in order to trigger some beneficial ability. Because, in that case for instance, you could simply attack with this unit and then sacrifice it, in order to exhaust a target enemy army unit and pull an extra couple of cards off the top of your deck. And hopefully, considering you're at that point embroiled in combat, those will either be valuable events, or combat tricks, or at the very least, shield cards. In fact, considering that this ability is an interrupt, if it just so happens that you draw 1 or more copies of an Elysian Assault team, you can play that unit in response to the very death of the Interrogator Acolyte itself, making it an exceptional value card indeed. And if it's fighting alongside the likes of our core set Colonel Strachan, then that +1 attack value bonus from being a soldier makes this unit all the more worth that initial investment of resources. Certainly, the obvious downside to this card, similar to the Tau Carnivore pack, is that if you don't manage to get it bogged down in combat, or if your opponent simply opts not to kill it, then you never actually benefit from that interrupt effect. And if that's the case, then you're paying an awful lot of resources up front for a relatively insignificant command presence. So, certainly it plays perfectly into the AM win leaves play faction theme and synergy, but considering that initial cost, unless you are ultimately able to end up losing this unit, unit, it could effectively prove to be a small bit of a liability. Still, proceeding even further down the road of risky cost-to-value propositions, we have the zero-cost event, Muster the Guard. It has one shield icon, the tactic and maneuver traits, and the text deploy action. Exhaust your Warlord to reduce the cost of each Astra Militarum unit you deploy this phase by 1. So, for no resource expense whatsoever, this card has the potential of saving you an enormous number of resources, entirely dependent upon how many individual AM units you are intending to deploy that phase. One obvious benefit to this event is that our core set Imperial Guard Warlord, Colonel Strachan, still grants his attack bonus while he happens to be exhausted, but all the same, when tapped out, he's no longer winning command struggles by default, and further, won't have any opportunity to retreat during combat until the end of the initial combat round. And considering he only has 6 hit points, even when entirely hale, leaving him exhausted can make for a dangerous proposition indeed. Still, if winning command is what interests you, being able to play a sanctioned psyker for the mere cost of 1 resource is an awfully alluring possibility, as is the notion of veritably filling the board with potentially command or combat-winning army units. But at that point, of course, you have to be holding a sufficient number of cards, which happen to be army units, in order to derive the utmost benefit from this effect. This certainly synergizes very well with a neutral event we'll be covering later on in this video, Calamity, in that if you can return a large number of inexpensive units to your hand, you can not only trigger when leaves play and when enters play abilities, but redistribute those units across any number of planets exactly how you'd like. And while you are still reinvesting resources in those units, those abilities may nevertheless be worth it. For instance, your Strachan's command squad would deposit their guardsman tokens, and then you might be able to better position them prior to that round's command phase, so that you can hopefully eke out as many command struggle wins as possible. Certainly, this card stands only to improve as we see all the more when enters play style abilities, and of course, more Astra Militarum card advantage conferring effects. So, at the moment, and certainly at the time of this war pack's initial release, this one remains a dubious deck inclusion indeed. Definitely one to watch, but if and when it becomes truly powerful, for the moment, remains to be seen. Nevertheless, the last of our AM cards to discuss is Noble Deed, a 1-cost event and combat trick with a single printed shield icon. It has the tactic trait and text action. Sacrifice an Astra Militarum unit to deal damage equal to its printed attack value to a target enemy unit at the same planet. So, this initially seems like a reasonably powerful, relatively inexpensive card, but considering you need sacrifice a unit, that certainly does add to the expense. Granted, you trigger any number of when units leave play style effects, and considering as well that you can opt to sacrifice an already exhausted unit, this event could provide considerable value. Perhaps one of the best examples of using this event would be something like having Colonel Strachan sitting at a planet, attacking with a Strachan's command squad for 3, playing this event, and sacrificing that unit to deal an additional 2 points of damage to the same or another target, and then reacting to the command squad leaving play by playing one or more copies of Elysian Assault Team out onto the tabletop, only to have each and every one of those individual additional army units also potentially attacking for 3. And of course, since that command squad itself ended up leaving play, not only do you get the chance of deploying myriad additional soldiers, but you get a modified 2 attack value guardsman token as well. You can rather handily follow up an attack by immediately playing this event, or you could instead opt to play this during absolutely any phase that you'd like. Maybe you choose to trigger it prior to command in order to destroy an opponent's command struggle winning Incubus Warrior, therefore allowing yourself to become the player, suddenly benefiting from additional cards and resources. Or you might instead use it before going into a battle, in order to destroy some of your opponent's most dangerous range, skirmish, or area effect attackers. And especially combined with the likes of a preemptive barrage, being able to front load the absolute maximum damage possible could be absolutely invaluable indeed, at ensuring you deplete and deprive your opponent of all their most valuable and battle-determining units. It's a shame that you can only target army units, and also that you're limited to only its printed attack, but considering the wealth of AM synergy that works with this event, it could be rather powerful indeed. You could generate additional ranged attack opportunities with a Cadian Mortar Squad, or search for supports with an Ingenseer Augur, and as our card pool ever expands, we'll only end up seeing additional options in time. So, whether or not you opt to play this now, or simply reserve mental real estate in remembering this card's existence for the future, I definitely recommend players keep it in mind. It circumvents punishments incurred upon receipt of an attack, as we begin to see later in the Warlord cycle, and in a pinch, being able to annihilate an area effect enemy, particularly one with ranged and or armor bane, prior to its opportunity to pummel your typically large in number standing forces, could prove absolutely invaluable indeed. So for this, for all of our AM cards, and for that matter each and every card I'll cover in this video, be sure to let me know your own opinions, thoughts, and play experiences in the comments section below. By contributing yourself to this content, it stands only to become all the better a resource for players, both veteran and novice alike. But, in any case, next up we have 2 new additions to the ranks of the Orcs, the first of which is the 4-cost army unit Death Skull Lutus. It has 2 command icons, an attack value of 2 and 3 hit points. It possesses the warrior trait as well as reaction. After this unit damages an enemy unit by an attack, destroy a target enemy support card. So, this immediately serves to provide one of scarcely few options for support destruction. In fact, at the time of this war pack's release, it was only the second said option we'd seen, and to this day it remains nearly unique. Notably, this card is non-loyal, but compared to the 2-cost Squig Bomb event, that resource requirement takes a significant step up indeed. So, while Orcs in particular remain in dire need of additional 2 command icon army unit options, that upfront cost stands as a tremendous deterrent, and though winning command struggles itself is great, if your opponent answers your Lutus with a 2 command, perhaps 2 cost unit of their own, then they might be able to outpace an Orc player economically with only trivial difficulty. Still, that cost seems even worse when you consider you'll likely want this Orc to be attacking, and for that reason, it makes sense to have him spend time at the same planet as your Warlord, where battle is guaranteed to occur. But, considering then that Warlords win command struggles often enough by default, the value of this unit seems to decrease enormously. So, Perhaps this might be best at the first planet, maybe with a teleportapad to send in reinforcements if need be, but considering that you need not always destroy an opponent's supports, because either they may not have any in the first place, or they may simply not have any in desperate, dire need of destruction, this overall strikes me as a rather suboptimal army unit. You also have to keep in mind that your opponent could simply shield against their 2-value attack, if they do have something really worth keeping in play, and given its HP value of 3, while certainly far from bad, it doesn't stand to benefit from Nozdreg's granted brutal keyword nearly to the extent of innumerable other orcish options. So definitely not a unit to forget about or dismiss out of hand, but I'd have definitely liked to see a somewhat different design. It's certainly worth considering it's a non-loyal warrior trait unit, and therefore someday might make a fine addition to a Colonel Strachan deck, but all the same, there are plenty of Archons Terror, Iron Halo, and ranged skirmish style answers to this unit. So before you drop it onto the tabletop, be sure to carefully weigh your options and choices indeed. The repeatable support destruction in the right situation could be absolutely fantastic, but the Lutus could also prove to make far less of an impact than that ability may have initially led you to believe. And if you're looking to absolutely guarantee you can destroy a support, outside of an effect like Nullify, despite the possibility for repeat performances inherent to this card, Squigbomb may ultimately serve to be a much cheaper, and in any case far more reliable and consistent option. Still, next up we have Smash and Bash, a 2-cost event with 1 shield icon, the tactic trait, and combat action. Deal 1 damage to each unit you control at a target planet without an enemy warlord to ready up to 3 units you control at that planet. So, another expensive orc event that can, nevertheless, pack a significant punch. The presence of your opponent's warlord disallowing your playing this event is a bit of a shame, but if they're opting to dodge your brutal units, or you force their retreat, then you can immediately serve to punish whatever present or remaining forces your opponent's left to linger by beating up and proceeding to ready your own units, so that they can launch all the more additional attacks against your enemy. Granted, all your units at a target planet take damage, and you can only ready up to 3, but they need not be orcs. You might benefit from additional brutal keyword attack value, and you could potentially activate the likes of a bad dog, which would immediately serve to gain additional command icons to contribute to you winning command struggles the following round. So this could be devastating, or it could not be. If your opponent was hoping to win through the ranged skirmish, or perhaps from their possessing the initiative token, this could allow you a pretty fantastic opportunity to dash some of their wildest hopes and dreams. This works exceptionally well with hard-hitting, albeit expensive orc units, and therein lies a bit of the problem. Because this event itself is a bit pricey, you have to consider carefully just how much you're ultimately going to be able to benefit. And considering that Battle Cry costs only a single additional resource, yet increases the attack power of all of your present orc units, and won't inadvertently ever kill off any of them, picking between these two, if you're considering running this event at all, might be a difficult prospect indeed. So perhaps this is best if you're playing an ally-heavy orc deck, when you often can't quite so globally benefit from that 2-value Battlecry attack boost. But whatever the case may be sure to let me know what your own thoughts and experiences are, because as is, regarding this orc event, quite frankly, I'm just not sure what to think. Regardless, with our Orc additions now fully introduced, next it's on to Chaos, and our first of two new units happens to be the Death Guard Infantry, a 3-cost army unit with 1 command icon, an attack value of 2, and 4 HP. It has the Warrior, Death Guard, and Nurgle traits, and no game-relevant text. So, quite frankly, at this point in our card pool, it stands as a strictly worse iteration of a Khorne Berserker. It has the exact same statistical distribution, albeit with different, essentially worthless traits, but notably, it happens to be missing that printed brutal keyword. So, for that specific reason, a great many players were rather disappointed by the introduction of this army unit, and perhaps the best case someone could make for including it in a deck at this point is just because the Chaos faction cost curve happens to be so high. Or perhaps if it's fighting exclusively alongside the brutal keyword conferring Nozdreg. It's certainly durable, it has a token command presence, and for the cost, it's far from an ineffectual attacker. It's just that players were expecting something more. So, at the moment, there doesn't seem to be any particularly compelling reason to use this unit. Perhaps someday we'll see those traits better explored, and indeed, in a future war pack we start to see some Nurgle synergy, but at the moment, the Death Guard Infantry stand as entirely underwhelming indeed. Still, if you were unimpressed by our first Chaos offering, you may yet stand to be convinced by the second. It's the 1-cost Heretic Inventor. With 1 command icon and a loyal icon, it has a shocking 3 attack and 3 hit points. It has the Scholar trait and forced reaction. After this unit enters play, your opponent may move it to a planet of his choice. So, given the enormous value of this unit, in that you're paying so little for a staggeringly high allotment of stats, this could make for a fantastic early game play. 1 resource for 1 command icon is entirely fair, and with its pool of 3 HP, it's not only exceptionally difficult for an enemy warlord to outright assassinate, but further, that steep 3 attack value could significantly punish any attempt to do so. And really, in a statistical sense, it compares favorably to many far more expensive units. The only problem, of course, is that your opponent can choose to decide where exactly the unit does end up deployed, and for that reason, this also ends up being a fantastic late-game card as well, because in many cases, as soon as your opponent has fewer planet choices to pick, it's all the more likely you'll have backup available to protect this unit and force it into a combat situation, so that you can get the utmost use out of it. But, considering just how powerful this unit is for the cost, is there ever really a bad time to play it, or a bad place for it to be? Even if it isn't winning command for you, you're still likely getting great value for the cost. And if it does end up in combat, then you're almost certain to end up taking down a much more expensive unit and trading favorably with this one. In fact, at some point you might even be able to trigger the battle ability of the planet Planum, so that you can relocate this unit more favorably. So, your opponent has to put this somewhere, and depending on where exactly they do put it, they might even reveal a bit of information to you. Specifically, they're most likely to put him at a planet that they don't consider valuable, which can guide you to focus your efforts on other locations. So, overall, I see very little not to like about the Heretic Inventor, and for all my aforementioned reasons and more, I'm excited to have Chaos see a new, extremely affordable, powerful, and flexible unit like this one. But on to the Dark Eldar, which receive 3 new cards, the first of which is the steeply expensive Uber Grotesque, a 5-cost army unit with 1 command icon, an attack value of 3, and 5 hit points. It has the Creature, Abomination, and Elite traits and text. No war gear attachments. Reaction: after you play a Torture Event card, this unit gets +3 attack until the end of the phase, limit once per phase. So, this most attachments ineligible army unit is difficult to put into play, and once it's there, it's definitely not going to be doing much to win command for you. It is reasonably durable, but for a single additional resource, the 5 HP flying keyword Blackheart Ravager certainly puts its survivability to shame. Still, whereas that flyer simply routes units, so long as you can play torture events during the combat phase, the Uber Grotesque could outright obliterate enemy units entirely. So, while with both units, enemies do ultimately end up vacating the premises of any given planet, when it comes to the Grotesque, you need not necessarily worry about their ever returning. The problem, of course, is that if you can't manage to play a torture event during combat, and when you can benefit from it, then 5 resources for an attack value of 3 seems a rather ill-advised investment indeed. And given the card pool at the time of the Howl of Blackmane's release, we only see 2 combat action eligible torture events: the Your Opponent Must Sacrifice a Unit, Power from Pain, as well as another event introduced in this very war pack we've yet to cover. And in fact, throughout the course of the entire Warlord cycle, we only ever see a grand total of 5 torture events, one of which is signature, and though they're all actions or combat actions, the timing between having your Uber Grotesque at a planet involved in combat and wanting to benefit from whatever torture event you happen to possess, or perhaps even just having that event in your hand in the first place, or the resources to pay for it, as I'm sure you can imagine, those factors simply aren't always going to align. So, considering still that even if you get this unit functioning, your opponent can simply answer your best of efforts and potentially careful strategic planning by opting to play an Indomitable or Glorious Intervention, there's just so much that can go wrong. Granted, as an elite, it is fallback eligible to be returned to play upon being destroyed, and it is entirely immune to being bounced back to your hand via deception, but nevertheless, considering the susceptibility to Archon's Terror and innumerable other card effects we see throughout the Warlord cycle, this strikes me as an incredibly steep investment that a Dark Eldar player, all too often strapped for resources through trying to choke and starve their opponent, is frankly unlikely to want to pay for and fight with. Still, regardless as to your feelings about our Uber Grotesque, onto the ubiquitously loved and non-Dark Eldar maligned Archons Palace. It's a unique support with a cost of 2, a loyal icon, and the location trait. It reads Interrupt. When your opponent wins a command struggle, exhaust this support to cancel either the card bonus or the resource bonus of that planet this phase. So, though you need make an initial investment of 2 resources, the economic advantage that this card could manage to confer can, throughout the course of a game, quickly become significant and monumental indeed. Although this card is unique, and therefore the number of copies with which to include in your deck comes quickly into question and dispute, its ability to choke your opponent of cards or starve them of resources is, at this point in the card pool, utterly unrivaled. Considering specifically that denying a planet of its card or resource bonus happens to include all additive effects, ranging from the +1 resource token of a rogue trader to the extra cards and resources conferred by an Eldar survivalist, this support can deny an opponent of an enormous amount of income. Consider still further that many of our core set planets have an inherent +2 card or resource bonus. So, as soon as you manage to negate one of those effects, this card has essentially paid for itself in already starting to establish an economic disparity, and each additional activation beyond the first serves only to increase that economy gap between you and your opponent still further. If you can manage to win the majority of command struggles, being able to pick and choose where exactly to deprive your opponent of their own command phase victories can be enormously powerful, and if you ensure that you're the player winning command struggles at planets that happen to confer both cards and resources, this support makes it all the more likely you might be able to end up cutting off your opponent's income entirely. Plus, considering just how scarce support destruction effects are at this point in the card pool, it's exceptionally unlikely that your opponent is going to be able to remove this location from play. So, remember that they'll instead be forced to attempt to work around it, and therefore be sure to try your very best to prevent them from doing just that. Naturally, your opponent will want to strike a roughly equivalent balance between card and resource bonuses on any planets they're likely to win command. For instance, doing things like putting a card advantage conferring Void Pirates on the likes of a 2 resource bonus planet, so that if you cancel the resource bonus, they still draw a card and vice versa. Similarly, they might put an Eldar Survivalist on a 1 card and 1 resource bonus planet, so that no matter what bonus you cancel, they will ultimately manage to accrue 2 of the alternative. And of course, when it comes to income bonus allies, your opponent will want to avoid stacking as much as possible. Having 3 rogue traders and 3 survivalists on the same 2 resource token planet seems absolutely insane, when you could simply opt to exhaust your Archons Palace in order to negate an influx of 8 total resources. So, whether playing with or against even the remote possibility of this support entering play, be sure to remain mindful of those tactics. And further, when planning ahead for the combat phase, be mindful that you also account for and consider just how many cards and resources you may win or be deprived of during command. For instance, if you're wanting to use a drop pod assault during combat, you might want to be sure to spend fewer resources during deployment than you otherwise would, just in case your opponent looks likely to starve you of resources during that command phase. And for that reason, if you're the player opting to use this support, keep in mind your target for this effect can always be changing. If you really need to deprive your opponent of as many shielding opportunities as possible, then pick card bonus deprivation. Or, instead, if you're afraid of events or ambush units, depending on the cost of the specific card you're afraid of, then you might want to opt for resources. Whatever the case may be, this is an extraordinarily powerful support indeed, and given the Dark Eldar predilection for a choking and smothering style of play, it's an absolutely fantastic means of battering and blocking your opponent's economy. And the earlier you manage to get this into play, the more enormous that economic disparity will ultimately prove to become. Considering still further that when the time comes for you to pick which bonus to cancel, you'll know exactly what your opponent's command phase income, in regard to cards and resources, is going to be. Taken all together, this just strikes me as an absolutely monumental and staggeringly powerful support. So, last and perhaps second to least of our nevertheless quite reasonably powerful Dark Eldar trio of cards is the 3-cost event, Visions of Agony. It has a single printed shield icon, the tactic and torture traits, and action. Look at your opponent's hand. Then, choose and discard one card from that hand. So, quite clearly, this provides an absolute wealth of information and affords you an enormous bit of power. Despite the obvious and rather significant expense, this event can be used during any phase that you'd like and immediately unveils the entire contents of your opponent's hand. If you play this immediately prior to the conclusion of the command phase, then going into combat, you'll know exactly how many shield cards your opponent has. Further, you'll know if they have ambush units or combat tricks or any kind of relevant event. Alternatively, perhaps if instead played during the deploy phase, you'll know exactly what your opponent could or might play. You'll know whether or not to expect a possible unit relocation from their potential copy of Sicarius' Chosen, or whether you need to work around an Exterminatus or Doom. And although the investment of 3 resources into a single event does seem initially expensive, considering that you can pick and choose which specific card to remove from your opponent's hand, could prove to be nearly invaluable at almost any price. You might get lucky and discard one of their as-of-yet unplayed linchpins, or most integral components of their deck. Perhaps something along the lines of an Omega Zero command post, or veteran brother Maxos, or you might be able to remove an extraordinarily dangerous card that could have easily devastated you. For example, if you're expecting a very narrow victory during combat, being able to remove a copy of Gun Drones or Gift of Isha from your opponent's hand could prevent them from having the opportunity they may have needed in order to have stolen a victory in that battle from you. Or you can even use this event to ensure that your most devious of tricks go through. For instance, even if facing off against an Eldar opponent, if you absolutely need to play a copy of Archons Terror successfully and want to dodge the event-canceling Nullify, if you play Visions of Agony, they either use Nullify to cancel it, or you simply opt to discard Nullify from their hand. You can even use it to help facilitate card or resource starvation, by depriving your opponent of a card that may have granted some sort of gradually increasing economic advantage. And while this may not be the best or most useful card to see in your opening hand, it could certainly prove absolutely invaluable when pulled at the right time. Information and the power of surprise is nearly indescribably powerful in this game, and in that respect there's scarcely a more educational card than Visions of Agony. It even counts as a torture event for if you're playing the uber grotesque, and it can feed army units into your opponent's discard pile in order to buff the attack value of your virulent plague squad. And considering still further that someday we see in a future war pack a warlord who plays torture events at a still lesser cost than does Kith, whether or not you opt to use this event now or simply wait until later, the wealth of possibilities it facilitates are utterly intriguing. Still, with our latest from Kimura now quite thoroughly covered, onto our original Eldar, the first of which is an army unit, the 3-cost Vaulting Harlequin. It has 2 command icons, an attack value of only 1, but an alarming 4 hit points. It has the warrior and Harlequin traits and combat action. Exhaust this unit to have it gain flying until the end of the phase. So, this is quite clearly another reasonable command-centric option for the Eldar. 2 command for 3 resources isn't the best value we've seen, but considering its cost, the Harlequin nevertheless packs near unrivaled survivability. Unlike the Soaring Falcon, it doesn't possess mobile, but its combat action makes it all but invulnerable to assassination. Granted, it requires exhaustion to trigger its ability, but being able to effectively attain an essential 8 hit points on a 3-cost army unit, despite its paltry single point of attack value, leads to some eyebrow-raising possibilities. For instance, if you ally with Tau, an ion rifle affixed to this unit immediately makes it a 4/4, and so long as you're willing to forego an initial attack during that first round of combat, a 4/4 flyer for 4 resources, but albeit 2 cards, is for the Eldar not only a formidable attacker, but worryingly durable indeed. It definitely compares favorably to the 3-cost, 2-hit point Iyanden Wraithguard, for instance, and if you are allying with the Tau, or perhaps if you are playing a Tau faction deck and opting to include this non-loyal army unit, the statistical augmentation conferred by Shadow Sun's Stealth Cadre can make the Vaulting Harlequin enormously more powerful, and Repulsor Impact Field can, regardless of your needing to exhaust this unit to grant it flying, allow it to dish out an at times absurd amount of damage to your enemy. So, while I will freely acknowledge that for a command-savvy unit, survivability is by no means the most appealing option, because, for instance, while you can nearly guarantee the Harlequin will survive to run away from an enemy warlord's attempts at assassination, as soon as it's included within your warlord's retinue, and it shows up during the command phase again from your HQ, exhausted at a planet alongside your warlord, then you're in that very moment not deriving any benefit from those once expensive 2 command icons. And for that reason, it seems that often enough, it's simply going to be outperformed by similar within-faction options. If you're wanting a reliable, survivable army unit able to dodge assassination and consistently win command, you may want to opt for an equivalently costed Soaring Falcon. Or, if you want to win command and be immediately threatening during combat, you might instead want to pick an Altansar Rangers. So, whether or not this unit seems to fall in the middle, or whether you're able to perhaps augment it to a respectable or even enormous height of power, it all ultimately comes down to your personal preference, playstyle, and deck composition. So, perhaps not stellar by itself, but ultimately perhaps a reasonable addition to an Eldar or Tau deck. So let me know your own thoughts regarding the Harlequin, share your own experiences, opinion, and assessment, because for the moment, while it may not seem like the Vaulting Harlequin need be outright avoided, I remain at least somewhat unconvinced. But next, in our second Eldar card, we have Star Cannon, a 0-cost attachment with 1 shield icon, as well as the hardpoint and weapon traits. It reads, attached to an Eldar vehicle army unit. Attached unit gains Armor Bane. So, the first of its kind, this non-war gear hardpoint attachment actually allows you to augment vehicles. It has absolutely no cost, apart from the card this attachment is printed upon, and quite clearly Armor Bane is a spectacular keyword. It can allow you a nearly guaranteed means of softening up your opponent's warlord or most valuable units to be later conveniently coup de grace by an Iyanden Wraithguard or other similarly hard-hitting attacker. Or it might also provide a bit of pressure for your opponent to be more free with shield cards early during a game, if they know to expect a potentially surprising Star Cannon to be unexpectedly affixed to one of your vehicles later. And, though this is indeed restricted to Eldar vehicles, we nevertheless happen to have several interesting options available now, and stand only to gain all the more with naught but the passage of time and the inevitable expansion of our card pool. Still, even the Soaring Falcon, a one-attack, mobile unit, can inflict a reasonable bit of guaranteed punishment, given its 5 hit points. Or you could instead opt to affix this to the likes of a 6-cost, albeit 5 HP flyer, the Wailing Wraithguard, because having an enormously durable 3-attack value unit suddenly gain Armor Bane could be spectacularly powerful indeed. And further still, perhaps the utmost flexible and most powerful option upon which to affix this attachment we've seen yet would happen to be the Wild Rider Squadron, because not only is it a reasonably costed option requiring a resource investment of 4, but it has a respectable printed 3 attack value, a rather durable pool of 4 HP, and importantly, can use its combat action in order to move between planets and therefore participate in what could easily prove to be multiple battles each round. And though you'll always need to manage to keep it alive through its potentially arriving at a new planet exhausted, needing to ready at the end of a combat round prior to its attacking again, if you can use a combination of initiative during battles and or Eldar faction exhaustion effects and or shield cards in order to set up for multiple favorable combats during the same turn, then you could potentially rather easily swing a tremendous number of battles in your favor, and with its attack value of 3, preventing your opponent from having an opportunity to use their own shield cards could, if given the chance, prove to be utterly devastating. You just always want to be mindful of the fact that spending fewer shield cards means an opponent in turn holds on to more events and attachments than they would otherwise have. But considering that for no resource cost at all, and that you can therefore play this as your very last, perhaps entirely by surprise deploy action, even if you've entirely depleted your pool of standing resources, the Star Cannon seems a fantastic way to brutally respond to your opponent leaving themselves at all vulnerable. It certainly serves to paint an enormous target on whichever unit you stick it to, but so long as you play this attachment with that in mind, I'm nevertheless confident that this attachment could result in significant benefit. Still, the third and last of our newest Eldar faction entries happens to be an event which itself perfectly supplements and synergizes with Star Cannon. It is Empower. For a cost of 3, it has 2 shield icons, a loyal icon, and the power trait. It reads, play only during a battle. Combat action. Each Eldar unit you control at a target planet gets +1 attack and +1 HP until the end of the battle. So, clearly this card possesses a fair few worrying limitations and restrictions. Obviously, the cost is off-putting, and further, the effect influences only Eldar units in one battle, at one planet, and until the end of that battle. It provides an ephemeral HP boost, but that doesn't even persist until the end of the phase. So, for example, a temporarily 5 HP Wild Rider Squadron, being kept alive by merit of this effect, can not use a combat action to move away from that planet in order to keep fighting during a subsequent battle that turn. It would immediately lose its extra HP as soon as it moves away and serve only to be outright destroyed and discarded. But of course, this effect could easily keep units, at least temporarily, alive, long after they'd have otherwise died, and in a pinch, this has the potential of creating a monumental combat math swing. one additional attack value may not seem like much, but each and every point of advantage over the course of any combat can easily prove invaluable in the right circumstance. It immediately creates far more pressure for your opponent to use shields, or, especially considering just how many options to access Armorbane the Eldar faction are beginning to possess, your already dangerous units could suddenly turn lethal. I often use the example of an Iyanden Wraithguard to illustrate my Eldar points, but considering that a sudden increase to an attack value of 5, particularly if you'd already managed to bloody one of several different warlords, means that you might suddenly win a game or otherwise force your opponent to retreat, necessitating they waste combat actions just to ensure they don't immediately lose the game outright. And of course, while HP increases may never be quite as alluring as attack bonuses, keeping your units alive as long as possible means they'll likely survive at least ever so slightly longer, in order to deal out more attacks and damage in turn. And considering that Eldar units aren't typically tremendously durable, that effect alone could easily prove invaluable. And like I mentioned before, though this event is quite clearly expensive, hopefully an Eldar player managing to win the majority of command struggles will have established an adequate income to fund this event, and a sufficient economic disparity between players that they feel justified in playing Empower, and hopefully manage to derive a potent and worthwhile value from it. Granted, it's of paramount importance to remember that this does not influence any allied or neutral units, but it does happen to affect your Warlord, and considering that multiple copies of this event are additive, makes it all the more potentially powerful indeed. And, although that HP increase only persists until the end of the battle, in some cases it simply need not last until the end of the phase. For instance, if you're fighting the Space Marines and can force Captain Cato Sicarius to retreat, even if several of your units ultimately expire upon the inevitable conclusion of combat, if that SM Warlord isn't present sitting at that planet at the point of the battle's resolution, then he doesn't manage to trigger his resource accumulating ability. And of course, it goes without saying that, for an army so fragile as the Eldar, having the flexibility of another 2 shield value card is anything but unwelcome. And while the Eldar army doesn't have strength in numbers per se, owing to their often rather steep expense, by merit of the sheer volume of their units possessing mobile, you could potentially stack a tremendous number of combatants at a single planet. Or instead, you could simply use this event to supplement a relatively small standing army, simply to give you the exact numerical advantage you need in order to overcome whatever opposition you face. So, expensive to be sure, but most definitely not worth discounting, and a powerful addition to the Eldar indeed. So, throw it in your decks, experiment, and whether or not you use it as a shield or for its intended effect, I think it's hard to go wrong with this event. It shores up traditional Eldar weaknesses, and further, allows you to accentuate and derive all the more benefit from your established strengths. So, I like Empower. I definitely consider it a strong contender for Eldar deck inclusion at this point, and remain quite curious to see just how its utility and usage waxes and wanes in time. But, as the very last of our factions to discuss, there remains the Tau, and the first of 3 new additions is the justifiably feared Ennui Prelate. With a cost of 4, this army unit has no command icons, a loyal icon, an attack value of 4, and 3 hit points. It has the soldier and ethereal traits, as well as ambush. It reads reaction. After you deploy this unit, each each other Tau unit you control at this planet gets +1 attack until the end of the phase. Forced reaction. After this unit resolves its attack, move it to your HQ. So, for a very steep upfront expense, this unit can nevertheless enter a fight by surprise, and to potentially catastrophic effect. An unexpected attack of 4 is formidable to say the least, but it becomes all the more dangerous when augmented and supplemented with other synergistic effects. For instance, if you deploy this unit during combat, you might use your next available action to trigger an ambush platform in order to deploy an ion rifle at no additional cost to this unit, and an attack of 7 is extraordinarily potent. Not only do you have the possibility of taking an opponent's 7 HP entirely Hail Warlord to bloody in a single blow, but additionally your relatively vulnerable and low HP prelate then immediately vanishes from combat and returns to your HQ. But while it does happen to survive that initial battle, keep in mind that it's also likely to enter a subsequent combat, presumably because it was commit to a planet alongside your Warlord, exhausted and totally exposed. Still, extraordinarily hard-hitting indeed, and when you consider further that eventually we're going to see a Warlord that confers other Tau units present at his planet the Armorbane keyword, then the potential inherent to the Prelate bounds instantly higher. And, as if it weren't doing enough already, this army unit bolsters the attack value of your other Tau units present at the planet selected for his deployment, and a global boost of 1 attack, for all its similarity to the afore discussed Empower, is exceptionally powerful. Really, considering all that it does, the Prelate seems like an absolute bargain, but because it's unable to stick around after an attack, another significant issue with this army unit to keep in mind is that it won't win battles unless entirely unopposed by itself. And, granted, albeit like innumerable other army units, is left entirely exposed and vulnerable to effects like Tzeentch's Firestorm and Archon's Terror after it's been ambushed into play, in potentially removing it from combat prior to its opportunity to launch its surprise attack. But still, considering that you nevertheless benefit from that Tau-enhancing reaction, it not only remains a very powerful unit, but further, one that stands to become increasingly so as we see more, soon-to-come, trait-relevant synergy. So, strong in its own right, and definitely a unit that works perfectly alongside any number of other Tau effects. But next we happen to have a second army unit, the 3-cost Piranha Hunter, an adherent to the greater good with no command icons, an attack value of 2, 2 HP, and the vehicle and speeder traits. It reads no war gear attachments and is mobile. Reaction: after this unit moves from one planet to another, draw 1 card. So, given its printed cost, it's exceptionally expensive given its distribution of statistics. It's neither a cost-effective attacker nor defender, is ineligible to receive the usual complement of myriad Tau war gear attachments, but does happen to possess mobile, allowing it a convenient means of dodging combats under almost any circumstance. Though, in a pinch, if you need as many bodies as possible present at a planet, that keyword can also allow you the option of piling in as many attackers as you can to one planet of contention. And if you're intending to play an Ennui Prelate, an attack value of 3 in that instance doesn't seem nearly so bad. But the major benefit of this card is by no means its combat ability. It's that reaction, because played made early and if kept alive, so long as you can shift this unit from planet to planet each turn, it can ultimately serve to net you an additional guaranteed card draw each round, and that's almost never unwelcome. The problem, of course, is the inconsistency with which you'll draw this card and when you ultimately draw this card. During the late game, it may not have the time nor movement available to it in order to generate you a significant number of cards, or if drawn early, because of its printed 0 command presence, you might not feel its investment is justified. So for that reason, it's a natural target for promotion, because if you can instead have a 2 command icon mobile unit shifting location to location each and every round, drawing cards and winning command struggles, it serves to make this unit immediately and significantly more appealing. You just want to ensure that, in wanting to trigger its reaction as often as possible, you don't allow yourself to play into an opponent's trap, or overinvest in this unit when it comes to attachments. And though you'll likely want to deploy the Piranha Hunter far down the board at a long distant planet to give it plenty of room to stretch and to roam, consider also that as with any mobile or ambushing unit, it could be a convenient means of stealing capture of the first planet if your opponent has, or hasn't, deployed accordingly. Really, the only other things I can think of to mention are that if you're ultimately wanting it to participate in a battle the same turn that it's deployed, ensure you place it at a planet adjacent to its final destination. And though it does happen to possess more than 1 HP, always be on the lookout for your opponent, perhaps once it's by itself, blasting it into oblivion with something along the lines of an orc cannon or other effect. And if at any point you can also trigger the planet Planum's battle ability, whether through Karnath or Planum itself, that allows you an additional devious means of potentially drawing still additional cards. But now that we've covered our 2 new Tau Army Unit additions, on to Homing Beacon, a 1-cost support with the upgrade trait and the limited keyword, Reaction. After a unit you control moves to your HQ, exhaust this support to gain 1 resource or draw 1 card. So, functioning rather similarly to the Tau faction-specific army unit cost-reducing support Frontline Launch Bay, this affords its controller the option of drawing additional cards in addition to providing resource advantage. However, at this point in our card pool, we see no more than a single effect that allows a Tau player's units to move to their HQ, which happens to be the aforementioned and steeply expensive Ennui Prelate. And although this support is not unique, it requires exhaustion in order to benefit from its ability, and happens to be limited, so that you can't play multiple copies of this support during the same game round, so that you can activate each and every one of them off of the same, at the moment very scarce, triggering event. So, in assessing this card, we certainly stand to benefit from having the foresight of having seen the entire Warlord cycle released at the time of my making this video, and therefore we know full well that in time this becomes a much more powerful effect. But still, considering all those aforementioned restrictions and just how long it can take to generate a profit from this support, even once we start to see additional units that move to their controller's HQ, it just doesn't strike me as particularly worthwhile. With all those limitations, and considering that being routed, retreating, and returning to HQ do not count as moving, I just remain entirely unconvinced. And seeing as how I'd much rather spend my limited actions on cards like Promotion or Recon Drones, There may come a day when I look forward to ultimately drawing and eventually playing Homing Beacon, but unfortunately it is most definitely not now. But with all of our factions out of the way, we've still one card yet to cover. The neutral event Calamity. With a cost of 2 and 1 shield icon, it has the Disaster trait, reading Headquarters action. Return each army unit with printed cost 2 or lower to its owner's hand. So, a step in the direction of medium cost to elite units being more practical, appealing, and playable, Calamity can handily serve to scour the entire sector all at once of low-cost army units. Though it doesn't outright destroy any armies, and in all actuality affords your opponent the option of redeploying any of their units returned to hand to be relocated more favorably, the cost of your opponents replaying their units could be trifling, or, alternatively, it could be practically insurmountable. And while this affects your units as well, you could simply opt to play around that drawback, if you consider it one, by playing 3 or greater cost units almost exclusively. Or you can instead opt to play a large number of units with when enters play abilities you'd like to trigger as many times as possible. For instance, you could bounce Murder of Razorwings to your hand in order to force your opponent to discard additional cards, or Colosseum Fighters to recur as many events as possible. A Kith's Chimera Masters could generate you additional tokens, and other factions benefit as well. An Astra Militarum player could return Strachan's command squad to hand in order to deposit a Guardsman token, or bounce an Ingenseer Augur to search for supports. They could even return a situationally most useful Elysian Assault team, perhaps stranded upon a planet, back to hand in order to be of a much greater use later during that game, and of course, ideally, being returned to play for free. Similarly, a Tau player could use Earthcast Technician to dig for all the more attachments, and though we don't see a huge number of additional beneficial effects that work alongside Calamity throughout the course of the Warlord cycle, it nevertheless could easily serve to become far better in time. We just need to see an adequate number of additional effects to warrant playing this card and investing its associated 2 resources worth it in order to bounce each and every 2 or fewer resource cost unit back to hand. So, definitely worth always remembering that this must be played during the headquarters phase, prior to your drawing cards, and while it may not be meta favorable at the moment, it's nevertheless certainly always worth considering, at the very least in the back of your mind as things change in time. But now that we've covered each and every new card introduced within the Howl of Blackmane War Pack, I'd like to thank you once again for watching. We've seen not only our first Warlord cycle Warlord introduced and thoroughly discussed in a previous video, but now we've also covered our first full expansion set in its entirety as well. What are your own thoughts, opinions, and perspective regarding the contents of the Howl of Blackmane? What are some of your best and worst play experiences with any or all of these cards, and how does this expansion hold up with time as the very first of our war packs? Please let me know in the comments, because with your input, these videos stand to become all the better resources for players both veteran and novice alike. But thank you once again for watching, and as always, if you enjoyed this video, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe to my channel if you've not done so already. If you do happen to already be subscribed, consider giving this video instead a share, as the more eyes on Conquest, the more likely we are to draw newcomers to both our game and community. So, thank you once again for watching, and as always, be sure to check back in again soon for ever more Conquest LCG content to come.